He was taller than she had expected. Sleeves rolled to the elbow in a way that displayed both control and a readiness to move. His hair was dark and cropped, the jaw clean and sharp as architecture. He had the quiet economy of someone who measured words like currency. "He's friendly," Norah called, though she had not intended to call at all. Her voice surprised her. It rode the wind and seemed too small. "Not always," he said. His voice fitted his face, controlled, low-voiced, the consonants precise. He stepped closer, and up close she noticed the small things that didn't make it into photographs. The faint line at the corner of his mouth, the quickness in his eyes when they rolled to something that wasn't the dog. "What's his name?" "Pip," she said. Saying it aloud made the cottage feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a home with a history and a dog who could outskip its loneliness. He smiled, the smallest fraction, the hint of something private. "Pip," he repeated. "Good name." When he extended a hand to touch the small dog, Norah watched his fingers. They were broad, with soft calluses at the pads, marked by a fine web of pale scars that paled under the sunlight. The scars spoke a language of work, hands that had done more than sign checks. When Cassian, she learned his name was Cassian Valente later, spoken as if the syllables themselves belonged to wealth, touched Pip, the dog settled, the muscles folding like a tide giving to the shore. Pip leaned into him, and Cassian's face altered in that private way people keep for animals and children. For a second, Norah saw a softness she had not expected and felt a small, accidental betrayal of her tidy assumptions about the mansion on the rise. "You live up there?" she asked, nodding toward the glass house, which had the arrogance of a lighthouse inverted. "Mostly," he said. "Business keeps me in the city sometimes, but I like the quiet." "Seems a long way for quiet." He considered that. "Depending on the week, depends on what quiet you need." There was an economy to his answers, and something else, like a careful design to what he omitted. Norah's life had been full of large omissions lately. People who vanished by degrees, promises that dissolved like watercolor in rain. She found herself studying him, not as a social ritual, but like sketching a stranger, mapping lines, deciding where shadows fell. He wore a nondescript jacket that suggested exclusion rather than ostentation. There was no designer logo to arrest the eye. Instead, the weight of him hinted at money, not in flash, but in absence, the absence of need to show. When companions came, they often arrived by proclamation. Cassian arrived by the patience of an object in the landscape. There was a stillness about him that suggested storms were a personal business he tended to privately. It made her uneasy, and in some small, guilty corner of her body, curious. "You live up there?" she asked, nodding toward the glass house, which had the arrogance of a lighthouse inverted. "Mostly," he said. "Business keeps me in the city sometimes, but I like the quiet." "Seems a long way for quiet." He considered that. "Depending on the week, depends on what quiet you need." There was an economy to his answers, and something else, like a careful design to what he omitted. Norah's life had been full of large omissions lately. People who vanished by degrees, promises that dissolved like watercolor in rain. She found herself studying him, not as a social ritual, but like sketching a stranger. He wore a nondescript jacket that suggested exclusion rather than ostentation. There was no designer logo to arrest the eye. Instead, the weight of him hinted at money, not in flash, but in absence, the absence of need to show. When companions came, they often arrived by proclamation. Cassian arrived by the patience of an object in the landscape. There was a stillness about him that suggested storms were a personal business he tended to privately. It made her uneasy, and in some small, guilty corner of her body, curious. They began to trade small, territorial courtesies, waves across the scrub, passing conversations about the weather, and once a brief exchange about the gulls whose aerial maneuvers she had been trying to capture. He would return to his house and she to hers, and the rhythm settled into the kind of slow recognition that precedes intimacy in the way low tides precede swells. On a clear night, he left a package at her gate, a thin volume of etchings bound in linen, a note wrapped around the spine. No more than that. Norah read the handwriting like a fossil, elegant and unhurried. Inside, the images were of hands. Hands holding nets, hands mending sails, hands cupping small, fragile creatures. They read like a way of saying something without saying it at all. Days shifted. They shared meals by accident, she in her patched cardigan, stirring soup that tasted of seaweed and thyme. He in his tailoring, sipping wine that tasted of oak and deliberate choices. Service trucks passed them less as disruptions and more like proofs that the world had the unwise habit of continuing. Sometimes they argued about nothing of consequence, the placement of a tablecloth, the best angle to watch a storm roll in. Those arguments were no more than practice runs for truth, small permissions to be seen. Norah drew him the way she drew everything that mattered, in charcoal and light. She studied how his hands folded around a mug, the way his shoulders braced against the wind, the odd vertical line at the base of his throat that might have been a scar or a habit. She caught herself staying later in the evenings, supposing that she was simply waiting for the sky to dim, only to realize she was waiting for him. The first time he spoke of his past was late and automatic, a careless confession thrown across chipped plates. My father, he said, built things the world needed and things the world did not ask for. He stopped. The silence after the sentence was not empty, it was the space after an axe had fallen. Norah saw, without a dramatic entrance, that the mansion on the rise had rooms full of decisions that had ripple effects. She did not press him. She had learned how to let people choose their own confessions. Her life, which had been a lineage of tidy compromises, began to taste different. Cassian's presence was a pressure, steady and magnetic. When he smiled, really smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes matched those she had drawn, the shadows that made him more than an outline. She felt with animal precision that the man was complicated in ways that would require a map. She felt with similar certainty that this was the sort of thing she should approach with caution. And then the small intrusions began. A black car idled on the far road one evening, its engine a low animal in the distance. It was a detail she could have dismissed as passing business. It sat there like a bruise, persistent and wrong. Pip froze when tires hummed a long note. From the porch she watched the vehicle for a while, then returned to her sketchbook, trying to braid the nervous energy into the curve of a gull's wing. That night the wind carried more than the usual voices of the sea. It brought an undertone, a distant, metallic clink, the echo of a thing being readied. Norah stayed awake with the house breathing around her, the waves a patient metronome. She listened for Pip's small, steady snores, and for the ordinary noises of old wood flexing. Then, 2 houses away, the glass lit up. The study in his mansion threw a rectangle of warm light into the dark. It was a different light than the tidal silver she had grown used to. The light blinked once, twice, and then went out. In the interval between the glow and its extinction, she thought she understood, with that panicked neatness a mind gifted by fear can summon, that something had shifted. A car idled at the road's shoulder, its lone headlamp catching the edge of the dunes like a watching eye. Norah wrapped her cardigan tighter and moved toward the back door. The air had a new charge, sharp and close. She stepped onto the porch, and the world smelled of rain and something else, oil and the coppery note of something mechanical set against the salt. Pip brushed her legs as if to say, "We should do something less than nothing." She saw Cassian then, across the scrub, a silhouette between the glass and the dark. He stood very still, and even from a distance he carried an unmistakable readiness, as if he were a man who habitually walked with the knowledge that something could break at any moment, and that he would be expected to make a choice about how to respond. He looked up and met her eyes, and in that look there was not only recognition, but a decision. He turned his head once toward the road, a small, contained motion, then began to walk down the path that cut through the scrub. Norah's stomach tightened. She had come here to be safe in the way solitude could grant safety, by obscurity, by absence of witnesses. Cassian's motion, precise and deliberate, changed the calculus. If anything were to happen, it would happen now, with the sea as witness and the glass house looming like a confession behind him. The black car's engine hummed again, a low animal sound. The headlamp swung, briefly illuminating the cottage, the dunes, the thin line where the road met the world. For the first time since she had left the city, fear arrived as a thing with a face, patient and expectant. Norah felt the old reflex, the one that had made her flee in the first place, the reflex that said, "You must leave now and not look back." She did not leave. She did not run. Instead, she held the doorframe while the wind tried to tear it from her. She watched Cassian cross the scrub in 3 long strides, his jacket catching the salt-scented air. He reached the gate and did not ask questions. He did not look like a man who made promises. He turned his head once toward the road, a small, contained motion, then began to walk down the path that cut through the scrub. Norah's stomach tightened. She had come here to be safe in the way solitude could grant safety, by obscurity, by absence of witnesses. Cassian's motion, precise and deliberate, changed the calculus. If anything were to happen, it would happen now, with the sea as witness and the glass house looming like a confession behind him. The black car's engine hummed again, a low animal sound. The headlamp swung, briefly illuminating the cottage, the dunes, the thin line where the road met the world. For the first time since she had left the city, fear arrived as a thing with a face, patient and expectant. Norah felt the old reflex, the one that had made her flee in the first place, the reflex that said, "You must leave now and not look back." She did not leave. She did not run. Instead, she held the doorframe while the wind tried to tear it from her fingers. She watched Cassian cross the scrub in 3 long strides, his jacket catching the salt-scented air. He reached the gate and did not ask questions. He did not look like a man who made promises. Instead, she took the towel he offered and felt, for a moment, as if she were accepting an island into her life. Outside, the rain leaned into the world with a new intent. Inside, by the hearth, she watched the man who had altered the coordinates of her night and wondered which contours of him would reshape the map of her life. The light in his study blinked once, and then, for a long moment, it did not blink at all. Far down the road, the black car's engine went silent. The house whispered with the sound of the storm, and Norah drew the blanket around her knees, while Pip, drenched and indignant, found the comfort of a lap. Cassian sat opposite, hands warm around a cup, and the room contracted into an island of heat and the smell of wet wool. "Why did you come?" she asked. Her voice sounded smaller than she had hoped. He looked at the window, at the way the rain made the world into a watercolor, and then he met her face. "Because sometimes things happen that mean you don't wait until morning," he said. "Because sometimes people make themselves responsible before they know the cost." She admired him then, not for the wealth she could see implied in his surroundings, but for the way he had stepped forward into an unknown expense. She did not yet know whether that expense would be the currency of protection or ownership. She only knew that the line had been drawn, and her answer to it would shape the months that were coming. The storm pressed at the panes like a living thing. Outside, the road threaded darkness to the sleeping town. Within, two people sat with a small dog between them, each learning the outlines of someone who might become their harbor or their storm. The light in Cassian's study blinked twice more, before settling into the steady amber that meant watchfulness. Norah sketched the moment with her mind, storing it as if she could return to it and find the place before anything had been decided. She did not sleep well that night. Every car that passed sounded like an assessment. Every creak of old wood made her hand go to the small pocket where she kept her keys. She thought, at one time, that the world of men with glass houses was a place she would avoid. Now she had gone inside. Now she had allowed a stranger to make a decision that included her. The sea kept its slow counting, as if to remind her that tides erase and rewrite without consulting anyone. At dawn, the rain wound down to an ache. Pip, ever the arbitrator, grew insistent for breakfast. Norah dressed in a sweater that still smelled of Cassian's warmth and slipped from the spare room into the quiet corridors. The mansion had more rooms than she could guess, but the one she moved through was not ostentatious. It had places for books, a piano with a dust cover, framed prints that studied the world with a curator's eye. Cassian stood at the kitchen counter, backlit by the pale, merciless light. He had taken off his jacket. The faint, vertical line at his throat showed like a shadow. When he turned, the tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction. "You're staying," he said. Her reply was a word that felt more like permission than a decision. "For now." He nodded once, as if that answered the larger question. "Good. After breakfast, we'll talk about the driver." She frowned. "Driver?" He inclined his head toward the window. "The car last night. It won't be the only signal. There are things in my world that don't like people coming here." Something in the air tightened. Norah had sought refuge from heartbreak and found in its place an invitation into calculated danger. She tasted in her mouth the salt the sea had given her and realized how close that flavor was to fear. "Then we'll talk," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. He studied her for a moment and then moved to the window. Beyond the glass, the road lay wet and indifferent. The black car was gone. The tide had smudged the horizon into a silver line. For a few seconds, the two of them watched the world as if trying to decipher the map of what came next. The choice had been made in small increments. A dog that crossed a gate, a man who crossed a yard, a decision to step inside instead of running. None of it felt dramatic in the way endings are billed to be. It felt slow, like the settling of a bone back into place. But in the economy of choices, it was enough to set the rest of their lives in motion. Outside, the ocean roared on, indifferent to the human calculations happening above its line. Inside the glass house, two people prepared to rearrange the terms of safety. The storm had not yet come, but the sky had already taught them how to listen for its arrival. They listened, and the house listened with them. Somewhere in the corridors, steps moved. Marco, or Leo, quiet, efficient, the sounds of a life with a perimeter. Norah drew a breath the ocean took in with the tide. She had fled to the beach to be alone. Instead, she had found a man who offered shelter and a complication she could not name. She kept the sketchbook under her arm like a talisman, as if art might translate the shape of the future before she had to speak it into being. Beyond the windows, a gull wheel arced and fell, and the day went on, ignorant of the way two lives had collided and could not now return to their former trajectories. The light in Cassian's study burned steady as a promise, and far along the road a shape moved, human, deliberate, a shadow that could be watched until it decided to reveal its intent. Norah sat at the small kitchen table and opened her sketchbook. On the first new page, she drew the ocean, not as it was, but as it felt. A broad, dangerous curve, and at the heart, a thin line that might be a harbor. Then she drew hands, two hands meeting, fingers not yet entwined, but close enough to promise contact. Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "and entwined, but close enough to promise contact". Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. She set the charcoal down and reached for her coffee, and in the thin steam that rose, she tried to read the future like a cloud. The world beyond the glass waited. The black car was a rumor on the road. The man who owned the glass house drank his coffee with a posture that contained both invitation and restraint. Norah had come looking for an end to a storm. She had found, instead, the quiet before another. She did not yet know whether that storm would cleanse or consume, but she had decided to stand and meet it. A horn sounded in the distance, precise and edged. The sound made both of them look toward the window. On the road, a figure paused at the bend and then walked away as if unsure. The tide kept its soft, relentless counting. The house, with its glass and its secrets, waited for the day to begin. Marco's knock was soft enough to be polite and hard enough to mean business. He entered carrying a tray, 2 mugs, a small plate with warm bread, a folded napkin. He moved as if the house had already taught him its rhythms, through rooms, past windows, along hallways where shadows had been given names. "Coffee," he said, setting the tray down. His voice was even, the kind that did not ask questions it did not already know the answers to. Cassian nodded without turning. "Thank you." Marco's eyes flicked to Norah, then to the sketchbook on the table. "She's an artist, sir." "She is," Cassian said. He watched Marco for a second longer, as though measuring what the man might be expected to carry back out of the room and what he would keep inside himself. Then he lifted his mug and sat, the movement private and small. Norah wrapped her fingers around the cup. The heat opened a path through the chill in her shoulders. Outside, the sky had grown thinner, the light that had been mercy earlier now precise enough to judge. Who was in the car? She asked finally, because the silence otherwise would have become a thing between them. Cassian sipped. He set the cup down very deliberately. A driver is not the problem. A driver is a messenger. A driver can be anonymous. What mattered was that the car was not meant to be seen. He paused. There are people who, when they find a place they think is theirs, will test the seams. She thought of the sketch of the hands and felt, again, the dissonance between making and being made small by other people's designs. Why me? Her voice was brittle with civility. Nobody usually makes things easier to overlook, Cassian said. Nobody is safe because they are nothing. But it can also be a mistake, or an invitation. He tilted his head. You left something behind that someone wanted back, or someone left something with you that they now want retrieved. Norah looked down. The charcoal smudged faintly on her fingers, and she rubbed at it with the edge of a thumb. I left a life, a man, possessions, that is all. And a sketchbook, offered.
And a sketchbook, Marco offered. He was standing at the doorway now, a silhouette precise against the pale hall. We should check it. She looked at him. In the way he said it, there was no prying, only procedure. Norah opened the book and turned to the page she'd done that morning. Ocean, curve, 2 hands. She felt foolish and honest at once. It's only drawings, she said. They don't have meaning beyond what I give them. Cassian's gaze lingered on the drawing. Humans are very good at making meaning, he said. We are terrible at pretending that anything we make will not be noticed. There was a soft mechanical sound from the road. Tires, a door. All 3 heads turned toward the window. The black car had returned, slower this time, as if deciding whether the house had remained. A figure sat inside, motionless. The parked car's presence stretched the world thinner. Cassian stood without looking frantic. He moved with that same economy of motion he used for his coffee, but there was an undercurrent of insistence now. He crossed to the window and drew the blinds slightly, then eased the sash open enough to listen. The air smelled of salt and damp upholstery, ordinary and treacherous. Stay here, he said to Norah. Do not go to the door. Do not make a sound. Marco, check the cameras. Leo. He stopped, as if expecting the name to summon someone. He pulled his phone from his pocket and thumbed it once, twice. The screen threw a narrow rectangle of light over his knuckles. Leo's at the west gate, he said. Tell him to sweep the lane. Marco left without answering. Norah sat very still, as if the house's quiet might be broken by movement. The black car idled. A door shut gently, then a human footfall on pebbled drive. The sound of someone approaching was intimate and final. The man who stepped up the path was not the driver from the night before. He wore clean clothes, an overcoat, hands folded around a small parcel. He paused on the door, looked up to the windows, as if searching for the small habits that reveal whether a home is empty or occupied, and then knocked once, measured. Cassian moved to the door before the knock had finished echoing. He answered without the polite distance of a man who invites strangers in. The man at the step did not look like a stranger in the sense of danger. He looked used to thresholds, practiced at the modesty of a courier. His face was intent in an ordinary way, focused, not emotional. A delivery for Miss, he glanced at Norah through the sill, Miss Caldwell. Norah's name in his mouth turned the world sideways. Cassian took the parcel with a hand that did not tremble. The paper was rough, wrapped as if to hide moisture. No stamp, no note tied to the bow, just a single bundle. "Thank you," Cassian said. The courier left before either of them could think to ask him the name of the sender. The door closed, and the house exhaled in the small sound of lock catching. Cassian set the parcel on the table.
Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era catching. Cassian set the parcel on the table. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Então falamos. He looked at Norah as if he were deciding how transparent to be. Open it, he said. Her fingers were clumsy with the sudden acceleration of fear. The paper gave way to a small square of glossy photograph and, folded beneath it, a card the color of insulted bone. She turned the photograph over with 2 careful thumbs. It was a picture of her, standing beneath the awning of the bakery she had visited 3 days before, the one that smelled of yeast and orange peel. The timestamp was precise. The angle had been taken from the street, low and unsympathetic. Her expression in the photo was candid in the way only a person unaware of being watched could manage. Behind her, just above the sign of the bakery, someone had scrawled in ink the same mark she had doodled in the corner of her sketch, a small, uneven line crossing a palm. A cold hand gripped the base of Norah's throat and did not let go. How, she began, and could not finish. Cassian did not let the panic find her voice. He folded the card open. There was a single line, typed, mechanical, and unnervingly calm. We know you make things hurtless. Return what does not belong to you. Norah read it twice. The words did not parse. They hung like a misshapen relic in the room. It doesn't make sense, she whispered. I don't... That mark, Cassian said softly. He slid his finger along the ink on the photograph, tracing the tiny cross on the drawn palm. It's not a symbol, he said. It's an identifier, a brand. People don't leave those by accident. Marco re-entered, breathless in the way of someone who had raced a few doors and found them locked. Cameras are clear, he said. 1 car, low plate. Sir, there's a pattern. 3 minutes ago, someone scanned the far fence. There's a drone track east of the point. A drone? Norah's voice was a small, incredulous thing. Above them, the gulls cried. Their sound had nothing to do with humanity's designs. Yes, Marco's face was flat. They were careful. This is a message and a test. Cassian folded the photograph and slid it into his pocket, as if its size allowed him private ownership of its problem. Pack a bag, he told Norah. Not everything, only what you can carry. Leave the sketchbook if you must. He stopped. Something in the set of his jaw told her he did not mean those words. Bring it. She stood as if moving through water. Her hands gathered clothes, a toothbrush, the sketchbook. There were small private things that mattered. She folded them into a canvas bag with the reverence of someone burying a name. When she came down to the main room, the house smelled of coffee and the ocean and threats. Marco had stacked a small pile of supplies on the serving tray, a flashlight, a compact first aid kit, 2 spare keys tied with twine. Do you want me to come with you? Marco asked. His question was practiced and yet offered. No, Cassian said. Stay in the house. Watch the exits.
Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Cassian said, Stay in the house, watch the exits. Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. We will go where they cannot imagine to look first, he said. We will go to a place that has no name on any registry. For a while, you will be someone who is seen only by those who can see. That is the safest place. She thought of the ocean, of the thin line that could be a harbor. And then? Then we find who is leaving marks on people's hands, Cassian said. Then you learn what you have that they want. Then we decide how to return it or how to keep it. There was a softness in his voice that surprised her, an admission that whatever the plan, it would require patience and perhaps violence she could not imagine. She stepped toward the door. On the threshold, she glanced back. The study light burned steady as a promise. Between its pages and glass, Cassian had made a room of watchfulness. Outside, the tide had pulled the world clean again, but the road still held an impression of tire. The black car was gone. The sea folded itself into untroubled sheets. Norah put her hand on the doorknob and felt the house's heartbeat beneath her palm, an arrangement of timber and worry, and people who name danger so it can be answered. One thing, she said. Yes, don't let them... She could not finish the sentence without naming fear. Instead, she tapped the sketchbook pouch. Don't let them take this. Cassian gave her a look that contained both a yes and an unwillingness to promise fate. I won't let them take it, he said, but I can't promise there won't be cost. They moved then, through the lower hall and into the back corridor where the house kept its private entrances. Leo's shadow fell across the landing like an impatient bookmark. He had that particular readiness that is trained and also inherited. He had been awake and thinking while others slept. West Lane is clear. 2 vehicles 3 blocks back. No signal on siren sweep. Good, Cassian said. He handed Norah a key that was not for a door she would know as hers. When you get to the boathouse, if we get to the boathouse, wait for a whistle. 2 notes, like this. He blew softly, a private punctuation. She learned the sound and put it in her pocket with the weight of the photograph. Outside, as they moved toward the lane, the gulls cried and the day watched them leave. The road that took them away from the glass house did not feel like exile. It felt like a recalibration of probabilities. Norah had fled storms before, personal tempests that left her disheveled and raw. And this was something different because it had will. Someone had decided she should not remain undiscovered. Someone had traced her and left her the proof like a challenge. As they moved, a figure watched from the bend in the road, holding himself against a lamppost as if he were a part of the street. He held a cigarette like a compass. For a second, he looked like a man deciding how far he could go without stepping into consequence. Then he lowered his chin and walked away, as if whatever answer he sought had not yet been given. They walked on, and the house with its squares of glass receded behind them, the study light a small star against glass. Norah carried her sketchbook as if it were a fragile animal that could not be abandoned. Cassian's hand, when it brushed her sleeve in passing, was a map, a direction given without the need for words. In the back lane, a van waited, its engine a low, patient thing. Marco slid into the driver's seat and met Cassian with a glance that said, "We are all armor now." The van's mirror showed the road behind them, and in that small glass, Norah saw the black smear of the world they were moving out from. They drove without music. The van's diesel breath mixed with the cold sea air and smelled like journeys. Norah pressed the photograph between her fingers until the edges sharpened. The mark on the printed palm had a ragged honesty to it, the kind of thing that implies belonging. She thought of the hands she'd drawn, so close to touching, and wondered whether that promise might crumble under the weight of a single inked line. Cassian kept his eyes on the road, but his attention unfolded in other directions. Calls that threaded through his mind, memories lined up like navigational beacons. He had made shelters before. Sometimes they held. Sometimes they were only places to pass through. "Who are they?" Norah asked after a long while, as if testing the silence. He exhaled. "They call themselves many names. They have places in common, and fathers in common, and debts they insist on collecting. They have ways of making people yield. I thought until last night that they had no interest in people who stopped answering. And now? And now they are curious." The van hummed along the coastal road, and the sea on the other side looked cannon straight and patient. Norah pressed the photograph back into her pocket. The sea would not solve this. It would only keep its watch while the human arithmetic of threats and shelter played out. Ahead, the road curved and the world opened to new risk. Behind them, the glass house remained a bright, unreadable object. "Old ink," he observed. "Older debts." He folded the photograph with a gentleness that suggested he understood how fragile certain truths could be. "You're late." Cassian's hand rested near the butt of his coat, where a pistol would sit if one were needed, and his eyes measured the angles of the pier, the light from the road, the place where dark might hold shapes. "We're not interested in old debts," he said. "We're interested in what you know." The man gave a short laugh, like a boat rubbing against a breakwater. "They're the same, most days. Knowledge is what lets them sell the debt with 2 more decimal points." He pushed his jacket back and offered a name that seemed to belong to nowhere in particular. "Call me Harker." "How many will be watching?" Marco asked, practical as always. "Enough to make bargaining interesting." Harker's glance flicked to Norah, then away. "But not enough to risk a direct pull on this pier. We use intermediaries, soft fingers, people who wear the night like gloves." "Who are they?" Norah asked again, sharper this time. The question had teeth now. It was no longer curiosity, but instrument. Harker's mouth tightened. "You don't get a single name. You get indices. There's a ledger out there that has more names than a city and fewer morals than a river." He folded his hands, elbows on his knees, as if settling in for a story that was both routine and urgent. "But," he looked at the line of salt on her wrist and the sketchbook under her arm, "this mark means someone claimed you. Not in the way of claim stakes and property, in the way of an account that must be balanced. They don't like loose ends." Norah thought of the man by the lamppost, of the cigarette swung like a compass. It could have been a coincidence. It could have been anything. Her lips were dry. "Can they take me?" Harker's eyes held a soft, knowing sorrow. "They can make a life expensive to keep. They can make certain mornings look very bad. They can hire people who are patient in ways that bend the rules around mercy. But," he looked at the line of salt on her wrist and the sketchbook under her arm, "this mark means someone claimed you. Not in the way of claim stakes and property. In the way of an account that must be balanced. They don't like loose ends." Norah thought of the man by the lamppost, of the cigarette swung like a compass. It could have been a coincidence. It could have been anything. Her lips were dry. "Can they take me?" Harker's eyes held a soft, knowing sorrow. "They can make a life expensive to keep. They can make certain mornings look very bad. They can hire people who are patient in ways that bend the rules around mercy. But they can't make you forget that you are a person who has the right to choose a wind to follow." He folded the photograph and slipped it into his coat, like a gambler hiding a card. "Why help us?" Marco muttered. The question carried with it a suspicion of motives. Harker's reply was simple. "Because they do my books wrong sometimes, too." They moved then, as a unit, across the pier to where a small skiff rocked against its mooring. Another man, broader and quieter, stood by a coil of rope and nodded without speaking, the kind of acknowledgement that might have been a blessing in any other life. Harker reached for the boat's oar and handed one to Cassian as if he were giving a sword. The channel was narrower than Norah had expected. She had imagined being taken to an island of rumor, a place that would be heralded by flags and torches. Instead, the place without name kept to smallness, a narrow cut between hulks, a watery seam where the town patched itself together and hoped no one would notice. Marco slipped them out with the careful economy of someone who had learned to trust silence and timing over bravado. As they puttered away from the pier, Norah watched the shoreline recede and felt an old dislocation in her chest, like a hinge that had been wrested but still functional. The photograph burned faintly against the inside of her coat. Harker's voice came to her from behind, low and without lesson. "If they come, they'll prefer a slow approach. They think fear is more manageable in small increments." "Who are they to you?" she asked, because she needed something sharper than metaphor to hold on to. Harker's thumb found the mark on the picture and traced it as if reading a map. "They are a company built on people's absences," he said. "They make quiet trades. They put names into cages and then sell the dreams someone else had for those names. They do it in offices you've never seen and with people you've never met. They are patient and they are thorough." A light, small, too regular to be a gull and too blunt to be a star, appeared to their left. It bobbed, then resolved into the shape of another skiff, its silhouette ripped by a spotlight aimed low on the water. Marco's hands tightened on the tiller, the muscles under his skin steadying. "Shadow on our port," he said. Harker moved without panic. He drew a narrow map in the air with his hand, tide, current, and the shallow reef that would make their pursuers think twice. He had the look of someone who had rehearsed narrow escapes and loved the rehearsal less with each passing year. The other boat hailed them, a voice like a pulley. "Evening vessels, halt and identify." Cassian didn't stop. He didn't accelerate either. He slowed the skiff into a glide that made them seem more like driftwood than a craft with purpose. "Out for nets," he called back, his voice flat and practiced. "Bad tide, engine trouble." The spotlight stayed with them, a committed question. The pursuing boat circled, light stroking the surface between their hulls. Panic would have been obvious, and obvious things were dangerous. Norah felt the thin current of adrenaline sliding along her spine and wished she could breathe it away. For a long minute, the sea held only the small argument of two crafts and a sky that refused to offer opinion. Harker lowered his head and tapped a rhythm on the side of the skiff. 3 soft beats, and for a sliver of a second it felt like a language older than the ledger Cassian feared. The pursuing voice came again. "Report your names." Cassian answered as if he were casting a coin into murky water. "Cassian Vale, Marco Dore, passenger Norah Ellis, local registry under fisherman's assistance." "Stand by," the voice said. The light moved off to the stern, as if it had found something worth watching there, and in that fraction of time, the other boat eased farther away. When at last they cleared the channel and entered a quiet basin that felt more like an inland cove than any harbor, the place without name revealed itself. Not a single building, but a ring of structures half on, half off the water. Lean tows, converted boathouses, floating platforms patched in mismatched timbers. They clustered like people who had decided the world had already made its plans and chosen together not to pay attention. A ladder slid down from one of the platforms, and hands reached for their skiff. Harker stepped ashore first and turned to help Norah. Up close, she could see how weathered his face was, how the salt had etched lines at the corners of his eyes. He did not smile. "This is where we pause the ledger," he said, as if naming the place might give it some legal right to exist. "We hold. We decide what to pay and what to throw away." He led them, without ceremony, into the hub of the community. The most lit place was not a lantern, but a cluster of people leaning over a table where maps and photographs were spread like a congregation of evidence. Faces turned as they entered. None were bright with welcome, but none were hostile enough to be feared outright. Norah recognized in one of the faces a scar that split a brow like a seam. A woman with a cigarette leaned forward and scanned the photograph Harker had refolded and slipped from his coat. "Heard the glass house fell out with electricity," she said. "Thought they'd just left." "Not everyone can leave well," Harker answered. "Some things make leaving expensive." Norah stood somewhere between the boats and the room, an island of feeling. The people here did not ask her to tell her life as if it were a confession. They inspected the mark, the photograph, the way her fingers trembled, and then did not. In their silence, she heard for the first time the possibility that she might not be only a thing to be balanced on some stranger's book. One of the maps on the table had a red thread pinned along a coastline. Cassian knelt and, in the light, traced that thread with his finger. "This is where they moved goods last month," he said. "They'll have been careful, they always are." His voice was precise, not without anger, but not given to theatrics. "If they wanted you quiet, they'd have done it already." A man in the corner, the one with the scar, looked up and said, "Maybe they like the chase as much as the capture." Harker's hand came down on the table like a gavel. "Then we'll change the odds. We gather the facts they trade on, and we make them expensive to hold. You have a face that refuses to fold in on itself, Norah. That is currency." She looked at them, Cassian, Marco, Harker, the scarred woman, and felt, absurdly, like an account being opened. The boat's diesel still hummed faintly in her bones.